Well, without further ado, we're going to kick off. My name's Guy Boggs. I'm the CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for Transformation in Mining Economies, CRC Time, and delighted to be bringing to you guys this presentation today on the handbook on multi-stakeholder approaches to socio-economic transitions in mining. I'm joined by an outstanding group of people who have undertaken and led the work that will be presented today. Amber Rowntree from the ICMM is the senior manager for social performance. Ed O'Keefe is the director with Synergy, and Liz Wall is the director of shared resources at Synergy. If I move on to the next slide, what I'd like to do is move into both the acknowledgement of country and also just remind everyone of a bit of housekeeping. We welcome questions, comments in the chats, and we'll try and pick up with them those things at the end through a Q&A. A reminder that the webinar itself is recorded and is made available through our webinar series videos from the website after the recording of today's session. So please pop questions in. We'll be popping up links to resources as we go throughout the session. And we look forward to both hearing a fantastic presentation and hopefully a little bit of opportunity for Q&A at the end. So I'd like to formally acknowledge country, acknowledging the traditional custodians throughout Australia and their continuing connection to lands, waters and communities, and paying my respects to all First Nations people and communities and to elders past and present. I'm joining you today from Whadjuk country as part of the Noongar Nation here in the west of Australia, and in the context of today's conversation, really acknowledge the enduring stewardship and connection to countries for many tens of thousands of years that our traditional owners have had, and really pay my respect to the amount of knowledge and cultural depth of understanding in managing those landscapes over such an extended period of time, and certainly in the context of our conversation today, throughout many transitions of landscape, climate and function, and a really important framing for our conversation today. So I've just got some opening remarks briefly. For those who know the CRC journey, one of the things that was really interesting was this emerging idea back in 2018 of why can't we close and transition mines into these post-mining futures? Why are we struggling to see that just completed in a systematic and highly confident way? And one of the things that was drawn out of those conversations was the complexity of the challenge of a transition. And one of the things that we recognised was the complexities driven by the multiple stakeholders that are involved in a transition, and how we've approached traditionally in the past, the concept of mine closure has not recognised those connections that are so critical throughout the life of asset and beyond the life of asset that enable different transitions. And of course, that's the other piece, is recognising that our mines are located in many different jurisdictions across many parts of the world. That regional context, the way it connects to the physical landscape and the socio-economic part of the landscape, again, really needs to come to the fore. So this idea of multiple stakeholders, how do we connect them? How do we connect them in the context of their place-based considerations was just really fundamentally important to the CRC, and what we've seen, just global recognition of the importance of that. And so I was really delighted to play a small role, but a supporting role in the way in which the CRC could help contribute to this handbook development. And I'm incredibly proud to see this emerge and into a landscape and a gap that has been well recognised. So that's my opening remarks, and with that, I'll pass to the wonderful leadership from ICMM, Amber Rowntree, in enabling this to occur. Amber.
Thanks, Guy. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to give you a quick background on the origins of this document from ICMM's perspective and what we were hoping to achieve. So for those of you that might not be familiar with the International Council on Mining and Metals, we're a membership organisation, and we're dedicated to improving the standard of mining to be more sustainable and more responsible. Our members at the moment are 24 global mining and metals companies, alongside around 40 national or commodity-based associations. And to be a member of ICMM, companies must adhere to our 10 mining principles, which is basically our ESG standard that defines what we see as good practice. And it's really the lever that we can use to drive performance improvement at scale. So through our membership, the standard is applied to over 650 assets across more than 50 countries. And while part of our role has been to set and update this standard, a lot of our work focuses on really supporting members to be able to implement it. And sometimes that's just, peer learning and knowledge sharing opportunities, or it might be commissioning a really specific item like a framework or a toolkit to address a certain issue, or as in this case, it's producing practical guidance. So why did we want guidance on this topic? This particular piece of work emerged from our working groups. So our organisational model relies on working groups on specific topics. And the working groups are made up of at least one representative from each of our member companies. And so in a survey of the members of our mine closure working group that had been using our closure maturity framework, we heard that despite them having the integrated mine closure good practice guide, companies still really needed much more support on social and economic transition. And while the good practice guide does stress, the importance of stakeholder engagement and transition planning across the life of mine, it doesn't provide that kind of detailed, practical how-to guidance. So the gap was very clearly identified through that cohort. But in parallel, the community resilience and skills working group, so people from different part of the business, were asked to identify gaps and areas of growing need in their discipline. And one of the top priorities that emerged was also social transition. And so the social performance practitioners in that group acknowledged that, this has typically not been done well in the past, that there's a real need to build community resilience through the life of the mine to better enable positive transition outcomes later, but that there was a lack of internal and external skills and capability in this space. So all of this to say, that the need for the work is very clear and it's very strongly member driven. The companies are really wanting to do better in this space. So what were we aiming for? Well, we believe that successful transitions into and out of mining require an ecosystem of stakeholders that all have the right information, all have the right skills and capacity to participate and to work towards a shared goal or outcome. And so that's why we were very intentional about having a multi-stakeholder focus on this document. It's obviously a shift away from the conventional company-centric closure planning to a more partnership approach. And although there have been, collaborative elements to transitions in the past, there's now an increasing number of approaches being applied to these situations that can be drawn upon, and that's exactly what we wanted to do. So we set out to create something that firstly acknowledges the real world challenges of socio-economic transitions in mining. They are multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, there's high levels of uncertainty, they're very context specific. And the reality is that on some occasions, these challenges won't be resolved in a way that meets everybody's expectations. But we wanted to provide some practical learnings and tools and case studies that companies can consider and pick and choose from when they're planning for social economic transitions across a vast range of contexts. Although the target audience for the handbook, I guess, is primarily mining companies in that it was to support our membership, there is a lot in there that's really useful for other audiences that may have an interest in socioeconomic transitions or that may need to partner with mining in these situations. Huge thanks to the Synergy team led by Ed and supported by Liz's expertise for their work in bringing this to life. I think the result reflects the scale and the importance of the challenge, and the feedback we've had has already been incredibly positive. And thanks to those of you on the line who contributed in some way through our research partnership with CRC Time. We really value your input, and big thanks to Guy and Gillian for facilitating it. But on that note, I will hand over to Ed and Liz to walk you through some of the key areas of the document.
Great, thanks very much, Amber, and thanks, Guy, as well. And also just to sort of note in terms of the work that we did, it was itself a really multi-stakeholder approach. There's an acknowledgement slide at the end with just some of the names of the people that were involved. So we were really drawing on a huge amount and a huge diversity of experience and input from kind of throughout ICMM, from CRC time, and from many other people who kind of generously gave their time and experience. So you know, we've tried to sort of cram in a wealth of experience into this bit of work. So why is it important? In the forward to the handbook, Tim Smith, who founded the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is become a massive visitor attraction. It's in a restored china clay pit. Creating billions of dollars of value for the local economy there. He really touches on a few things that are important and some threads that go through the handbook. The first is the excitement and opportunity that's created at that transition point, and that kind of mavericks like Tim Smith are often at the heart of these transitions as well. And he also talks about mining companies relaxing and embracing change. And behind that is another bit of the message, which in order to step aside and allow these entrepreneurs to come into these really complex, unique, locally based situations, mining companies need to perhaps stop playing the hero or pretending that they can be the hero in the game. And I think that's really what came out of the ICMM membership, is sort of people realizing that mining companies alone aren't going to be the solution in these transitions, and need to create the space and allow others to come in and be the heroes and be the entrepreneurs in the situation. And we know many of the successes as well. When we're sort of looking at the case studies, several places keep on coming up in the stories of really good examples of communities that have transitioned and are successful post mining, but their success is kind of deeply rooted in that mining, as in that story as well. And actually really grateful to Peter Whitbread Habitat's work on 102 things to do with the hole in the ground, as well as the precursor to that, 101 things to do with the hole in the ground as well. So many examples there to inspire us about the many good things that can be done. But actually, I think what really drove us in our work was we also know the downsides in these transitions when they don't work, and when they're not so successful. And again, I'm sure we've got many in mind. Just sort of a selection here of some of the places that we know that mining communities haven't benefited after mining and are left with really serious legacies. And I think as we started going into this, actually, many of us actually talked about the challenges and the failures as well. So it's actually been kind of quite heartening and inspiring for us to sort of be able to pull in the 40 plus case studies that we've got in the handbook of some of the successes. Some of them are not always, some of them we're kind of learning from the mistakes as well, but there's always things to draw on as well. So how's the handbook structured? This is a sort of busy slide, but this is kind of an overview of the flow of the handbook. Really just talking off about the key aspects of socio-economic transitions. What are they? What are we talking about? What drives their diversity? And then looking a bit at generally around multi-stakeholder approaches. I think when we went into this, there was an idea that there would be a general handbook on how to do multi-stakeholder approaches, but we very quickly realized that there wasn't sort of one clean, simple thing that we could have a handbook on. Here's how to do a multi-stakeholder approach. So what you see is we've sort of broken it up into 9 different types of multi-stakeholder approaches as well, sort of a bit of a typology of different kinds of approaches, and Liz will talk through some of those as we go through. Also got kind of 11 tools in there. Those tools are really summaries of processes which are out there already, so kind of almost signposts for people to look elsewhere. And we've woven through over 40 case studies as well as examples of those different kinds of approaches. So what we'll do now is just give you a really quick run through, again, just signpost some of the things to look at. It's a kind of really rich handbook that you can kind of dip into and dip out of. So we just want to kind of pull out some of the main aspects there. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. If you want to go one ahead. Thanks. So I guess if you're going to write a handbook about the multi-stakeholder approaches to socio-economic transitions, it would help to know what we mean by socio-economic transitions. Practically, a socio-economic transition can be a positive thing, or it can be a downward spiral. There's nothing to direct to state the direction of travel. But for the purpose of this handbook, we were very much looking at what happens at the end of the life of a mine. And we've intentionally referred to it as a transition rather than mine closure or the end of mine life, because that's a very company-focused way of looking at it. It takes your particular trajectory as a company and places that in the centre of the story, when really it's about a transition that's going to occur across a community, across its economy, with one player, yes, fading down, but hopefully other things coming in to be able to take its place, or blooming in the next phase of what's going to happen in a community. So that was the context we set right from the beginning. And if we carry on a little. So without meaning to spill all the beans too early on, these are some of the lessons that came out. And we're not going to go through all of them, but there's a few that we just really want to pull out. And as Ed and Guy and Amber have all mentioned, this really did come from a lot of conversations with a lot of people with the warts and all experience of what has happened. So first of all, you could call socioeconomic transitions wicked problems. They are complex. They are owned by many. They're accountable probably to no singular individual, and therefore they're fascinating to work with. Some aspects are definitely predictable, but the point, I guess, is that a socioeconomic transition associated with a mine closure is just going to be one part of a continuous process of change within a community. This might be the most important thing from the perspective of a company, but it is part of the fabric of the history of a community and part of the fabric of the future of a community that needs to be weaved into that construct. Within that, there's always a concern as to when do you start, when does the knowledge around the mine might close start to be shared. And this idea that people only start behaving in a manner to plan for closure once it's been announced. I think it's pretty clear that really everybody is bracing in some way for the eventual closure of a mine, either through sort of slightly wishful denial or through real active planning, a long way before it is formally announced. I guess another one is that mine closure is very rarely smooth or linear. How many mine closures have any of us seen where a company announces that in 2032 or in 2022, let's say there's going to be a mine closure, and it absolutely continues to work right up until 2022 with no changes to anything. There's never a second date put out. There's never a question of maybe we've got a new exploration ore body somewhere else. It just continues as planned and closes as scheduled. It's pretty rare. Within that, the context of socioeconomic transitions is difficult. Some of the cases that were on Ed's slides just before with the various sites that I'm sure many of us will be familiar with are perfect examples. It's hard to distinguish what is being caused by the closure of a mine, what's being caused by other changes that are going on within communities. For example, communities might have grown to surround mining projects over time in a way that when these projects were first anticipated in their first baseline assessment pre-mining, no one saw that coming. And finally, and I guess this is the real punchline, that the track record on socioeconomic transitions is mixed. It's very mixed. And unfortunately, it probably plays to the downside. So there's clearly a platform for needing to do this better. Ed, do you want to carry on? So I think for a long time, when people talked about mine closure, and this is really going back a bit, there was an assumption that, well, you're talking about rehab, right? We just need to grow grass and everything will be fine. That's all we're talking about. What we've got down the left-hand side of this is really the far better and more expanded sense of what are all the pieces of a mine, the features of a mine that you need to think about from a socio-economic transition point of view. And then what does transition look like? It's not simply making the grass grow. In isolation, it might mean making the grass grow in some places. But it's also, how do you repurpose things? Like, is some of the infrastructure that's there able to be used for something else? And some really creative ideas come out of that. Are there assets that the mine has that maybe they can be transferred? Are there opportunities to work with contractors and suppliers to help them diversify in advance of mine closure coming? Once the mine closure's already come, can you repurpose facilities? So it's a much bigger set of options probably than was really considered for a long time. If you carry on, please, Ed. But there's still a question around, why are some socioeconomic transitions more successful than others? And we spent quite a lot of time trying to nut this out and came to the answer that, unfortunately, as with so many things in life, it's complex. There are lots of factors which indicate whether or not, or can suggest whether or not this is going to be a successful socioeconomic transition, which does, just in brackets, bring up the question of successful according to whose definition. But for the sake of today, let's run with just calling it successful. I want to flag a couple of these. So you'll have all the detail in the handbook. But from a context point of view, the number of mining projects in the area, is this a singular mining project that's very remote, where the nearest community is far, far away? Or is this an area that has had a long history of mining? It's part of a mining district. Yes, one mine's going to close, but there's still 13 others in this area. Those two closure processes are quite different. One of the ones here around sort of environmental impacts, water issues. I mean, water is so often a huge component of the decision-making and the grief that can come up at a time of closure. How do you long-term manage water? Are there going to be concerns that sit within communities around their access to water, their ability to pay for water, etc.? Or something as simple as, well, I say as simple as, but really in reality, unfortunately not that simple. Where's government in this space? Is there a clear framework that's helping shape what the responsibilities are of different parties? Or, as we'll see in some of the cases, is there a decision that's been taken by government to say, actually, we want to transition away from a certain activity, and so we're going to help that process? Some jurisdictions have really stepped in to this space, others not yet. But these are some of the factors that start to play into when these things work well. Ed, back to you.
Thanks, Liz. So one of the things that we also sort of grappled with as part of the handbook was almost the mental models that we use around talking around communities and mining and transitions. And there's this ideal scenario where, as Liz said, sort of, mining operation starts and goes towards closure. And there's lots of benefits come out, particularly sort of employment during that steady state. Employment and procurement generates lots of benefits for communities. And over time, mining contributes to that baseline of community, so that it's left, and it's kind of left better off and still successful and flourishing post closure if it all works. And that's sort of often behind some of the way that we talk about these issues. But the reality is often very different to that. The benefits during operations may not be as much as expected to communities, and consistently, what we do see, or very often, is communities are left worse off during during that transition process, and maybe don't recover, or take a very long time to recover from any baseline as well. And so that's the sort of more common story that we see all over the place. And as Liz said, we sort of very rarely see this sort of nice, neat pattern of mines closing as planned. You know, they may close earlier, they may go into care and maintenance, or they may expand and have sort of many new lives. So sort of this idea of a kind of neat, clean, sort of defined closure process also doesn't come into play. So in some ways, starting to shift to think about and as Guy even talked about in the acknowledgement of country, starting to look at this from a community perspective, where they'll see mining as one shorter process in a much kind of thousands of years history of their community, and being resilient to those changes over time, and that unpredictability. So what we really tried to focus in on was that area around how can multi-stakeholder approaches sort of change that trajectory, and really focus in on how can communities become more resilient to those as well. So not necessarily just talking about better off post-mining, but how can they be resilient to that sort of unpredictability of it, and how can multi-stakeholder approaches enhance the benefits during operations as well. So really starting thinking about kind of ongoing resilience building, just as we're starting to talk, you know, just as we talk about ongoing rehabilitation as well. And so really just sort of starting to think about some of the aspects of just changing from the conventional approach to some of the emerging approaches, really talking about transition rather than closure, starting to talk about community resilience rather than just communities being better off, and shifting from a kind of transactional mining company led approach to something that's much more focused on a partnership, multi-stakeholder approach as well. And again, that includes around sort of funding and who's in control and who's contributing as well. Already definitely talked about kind of government, for instance, as actually being major players in many successful transitions as well. And in the handbook, we talk about the different roles that mining companies can play as well, which really came out. So really trying to shift the focus away, not just from mining company-led closure plans, but recognizing that mining companies can play lots of different roles. Sometimes it can be leading and implementing action, but just recognizing the power of companies to convene all of these all these different stakeholders, just simply getting them around a table, and sometimes the companies themselves are the ones that can do that. Sometimes just participating as another just as any other stakeholder as well. And again, that's sort of companies not necessarily being the hero in the story. Also playing a role in building the capacity of others is an important one, and definitely providing the money is definitely, but sort of seeing that as leverage or catalytic funding to crowd in other funding can often be important. And not underestimating just that role of companies in advocating and talking about these changes and sort of encouraging others to do so. Liz talked about the many different factors that can contribute to sort of wider transitions as well, but within multi-stakeholder processes themselves, we also talk about some of the enabling conditions as well. Sometimes they work, sometimes they won't. It's a sort of very rare, often a very rare combination of kind of stars aligning that allows multi-stakeholder approaches to emerge, which the flip side of that is also to say these things are really challenging, and many times these conditions are often working against multi-stakeholder processes. So different things at different times will help move things along to actually just that simple thing of everyone getting around the table and being able to work together. And probably again, the one to highlight, many of them are sort of pretty obvious, but ones to highlight are kind of government capacity and willingness to step in. In many of the cases, government is a real player, and willing government is a really important factor. And then the other one is entrepreneurship as well. Often that may be entrepreneurs outside the company, but also entrepreneurs within the company as well. So intrapreneurs can often be really important. So that sort of creative, passionate drive of people can often be a really important part of what makes these things work. Liz, back to you to talk about some of the different types of approaches that we saw.
Thanks, Ed. If you want to go one further forward, please. Yep. So this is really the jam. This is what came out from all the thinking and the talking, which is that there's effectively, as far as we can see, there's at least 9 different types of multi-stakeholder approach that might have a role, that can have a role in supporting the process of socio-economic transition. In this, and I'm not going to go through them in detail here because we are going to talk through each of them briefly over the next few slides. But just to get the construct of how we're looking at it, the first one that I think everyone will be pretty familiar with, the mine closure consultative groups, these have been around for a while. You could argue that these are very much sitting in that space of mining companies sitting in that convening role. But coming back to Ed's point just before, these different roles that companies need to understand and feel comfortable playing. There's a planning role that comes in around whether it's participating in other people's, so whether it's government regional planning process or community regional planning processes, community level planning processes. So sitting in there at the table, but not necessarily being the one who sets up the initiative in the first place. Then there's an implementing role. It's one thing to do a lovely plan, it's another thing to actually put it into practice. So whether that's a regeneration process, whether it's having a really hard conversation about land and assets, and do all those lands and assets still need to be held by the company? Is there an opportunity for someone else to own them in a manner that's beneficial for the community in particular? Are there opportunities for post-mining joint ventures? Probably the mining company itself is not going to be the hero of that story, but they have a huge role in making that possible for someone else to step in. And there is a little bit of finding the give and take between the perfect level of control that one entity might want and the relaxation of that control to allow the space for others to come in to participate. And then finally, there's, of course, the monitoring aspects. So keeping those bigger kind of structures in mind, then we're going to talk about each of the, if we carry on, we're going to talk about when these might apply. So as I think has been well and truly established, closure is not something you start thinking about when you're thinking about closing. Closure is something that you start thinking about, hopefully, before you've started opening. And what we've tried to do here is to map out when these different approaches, multi-stakeholder approaches, might actually reasonably be applied. And they're not to say that it has to happen at this time and you couldn't do it earlier or you couldn't do it later. Of course, there's flexibility. But to give you a sense of, if you look at the bottom, we're talking right back in exploration. So the collaborative regional planning processes often are already in place at a regional level, and you're the one coming to fit into it. Or maybe you can help prompt this conversation right from the get-go so that it becomes a development within a planning initiative. Similarly, some of the really early conversations around traditional knowledge, some of those consultation committees that are going to be set up really in the early days of mining blend beautifully or have the opportunity to blend beautifully into mine closure consultation groups as time progresses and people sort of shift from what that might be. Others, if we look at something like land and asset trusts, these probably come in later. It's hard to talk about these things well in advance because often there isn't enough clarity around, well, what land will need to be held, which assets are available for being able to be transferred. Similarly, the post-mining joint ventures, as much as we all might have aspirations for predicting how that's going to look, sometimes you really have to be there and see what the markets are. And maybe this year it's solar panels, but next year it's something entirely different. So the timing of when you're at that point will have a huge distinction on what the conversation might be at that point. And I just want to pick up the social investment foundations, trusts and funds. These aren't necessarily I mean, they can be multi-stakeholder approaches. In and of themselves, they're not necessarily designed to prepare for closure, but there's nothing to say that they can't be. And so it's getting creative with the things that we already know. And if you carry on one more, please. So taking the first cab off the rank, the Mine Closure Committee. Hopefully these are very familiar to most people on the call. And they are really intended to provide a forum, generally company initiated, but doesn't have to be, where you gather the input from a diverse range of stakeholders to try and help design what mine closure might look like. There's some really well-known examples that we talk through that you can see on the right-hand side. And as Ed mentioned at the beginning, the way the book is structured, or the handbook is structured, there are a number of tools that are mostly sort of public domain tools that we've gone through and sort of flagged where they might help. So you can see for each of these cases, for each of these types of approach, we've identified the tools that might be particularly helpful for those. But I want to speak to the specifics of Kalian. So Ed, if you go one further forward. So Kalian was one of the largest gold mines in the world, and it closed, it's located in Indonesia. It was a Rio Tinto mine, closed in 2004, so more than 20 years ago. Back, it was quite, I guess, known for the fact that there was a mine closure steering committee that had been established 4 years before closure, but it was a highly multi-stakeholder approach where they were trying to look at addressing sort of social and environmental issues coming from mine closure. But in the context of that, also needed to deal with some of the legacy that the mining project itself had over time. So there was an important lesson that came out straight off. You can't talk about the next thing until you finish talking about the last thing, which was a big piece of it. It had government, community organisation, academic and company representatives, but critically, the decisions that were taken in that particular forum were made by consensus. Now, I think we'd probably all agree that's pretty unusual. I'm not sure if we could get consensus on this call about too much. So it speaks to the power of what that process was. They had a number of working groups that reported to the main committee, which is not an uncommon structure for such things these days either. And it was really clear that the final mine closure plan reflected lots of changes and improvements based on the engagement with the community. So this is hopefully pretty familiar territory, but this was a particularly well articulated version of it. If we go to the next one. So I think we commented before, sort of we're now into these planning sort of roles. Collaborative regional planning processes, well, typically these are led more by governments, hopefully, or other parties than they are necessarily by companies. There's a whole host of examples that we've got here, all of which are covered in the book. But I guess the point is where you're bringing together a number of stakeholders to try and plan at a bigger level, a level beyond just simply the context of the mine itself. It's a part of the regional landscape, but it's not the entirety of the regional landscape. From that, I'm going to flip on and talk about Upper Nitra region in Slovakia. So this is an area that's been a coal mining area for more than 100 years. And in 2017, the mayor of this particular area began an initiative to try to prepare for the end of coal. That was a pretty controversial thing to do at the time. At that time, the government still very much supported the continuation of mining, and the company was fairly concerned when this work began, seeing it as discrediting the company and sort of suggesting that they were no longer welcome. Things changed quickly, and the just transition conversation really took hold at a bigger national level. And so while the local community was working towards developing this action plan, at the same time, the environment for being able to have that conversation was changing at a national level. And for a period, there was actually both a local planning process and a national planning process, which were happening effectively in parallel. At a certain point, the two plans came together. And they had a pretty comprehensive process of trying to bring people into this conversation, such that sort of over 60 people were volunteering to participate in that regional planning process. for anyone who's ever tried to run a voluntary planning process, keeping 60 people sufficiently motivated is no small feat. So they did a lot of consultation. They ended up getting support from a lot of other parties. So while the community faced the costs in the first place, or fronted the costs in the first place, subsequent costs were actually supported, particularly by the European Commission. And by 2019, the Region's Action Plan was approved, which is pretty remarkable. And Ed, I'm going to hand over to you at that point.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm going to kind of rattle through some of the other different approaches to multi-stakeholder transitions that we talked about. But in the meantime, think about your questions as well. We'll try and have some time for questions, so put them in the chat or the Q&A as well as we're going through. So the third type of approach that we saw was community level transition initiatives. So these were really focused on a single or a small group of communities that were particularly affected by transitions, and some of the actually quite a few of these have come out of Australia, but also like the Arrangement example in Namibia. So it's a kind of a mining town literally in the middle of nowhere that the company had always intended to close, but the government wanted to continue it as a town afterwards. So there's been a really concerted effort between the company and the government to transition this to a typical mining town. So a lot around bringing community together to sort of come up with a vision around what happens. And then many of these community level transition initiatives really focusing on sort of sometimes nitty gritty stuff like, kind of power distribution and schools and things like that. So it can be really very specific rather than sort of grander regional economic development kind of policy level stuff. And they do seem to be a sort of distinct sort of thing of their own as well, and very often local government driven in different shapes and forms. The next group that we saw was sort of almost the bucket for everything else that didn't fit in a way, but we saw that sometimes there'd be these sort of slightly different coalitions of different organizations, often NGO led, but groups coming together, sometimes in a more regional sense, and sometimes kind of businesses that weren't sort of the mining companies themselves, but other business groups as well, coming together to talk and figure out how do we go about this. Often very loose coalitions as well, so sort of may not be kind of a distinct named formal group as well, but often playing a really important part as a sort of safety net, catching the things which aren't covered by the bigger, wider company or kind of government-led planning initiatives as well. So kind of quite a diverse group of coalitions within that as well. Liz has mentioned social investment funds as well. I think when we went into this, we expected to find more, but actually the number of really good examples where mining companies, social investment funds and foundations have been set up and operated in a multi-stakeholder way were actually very few. But it seems like a really obvious way and an obvious tool for companies to use maybe their existing social investment funds as a way to sort of leverage those multi-stakeholder processes and build that community resilience longer term. So this is one where we think there's actually really huge potential for more creativity, more innovative things to come out as well. We think it's a bit of a kind of almost a forgotten area or kind of overlooked area for companies to use. So kind of in a way looking forward to seeing some new things and seeing some new cases as well. And also to say, Liz and I and many involved in this are sort of real geeks, so we actually still really enjoy hearing new examples that we've missed as well. It's a real pleasure when we find something. We get excited when we hear about a new case that we've missed or not heard about before, because there's always things to learn about as well. Land and asset trusts is again, it's a really interesting one that we found. So it's sort of actually formal trusts that have been set up to own, operate particular assets. Land is often the real case, but sort of handing it over to another party to do that. So in the UK, many of the former UK coal mining entities have handed land over to the land trust that then kind of helps and drives and gets financing in to redevelop these areas. Sometimes it's sort of using just the landscape as sort of a public open space. Sometimes it's regenerating it for housing, for new housing developments, but a whole variety. But actually creating this not-for-profit entity and sort of different parties involved in different ways can help take that sort of mined area in a different direction as well, and sort of look at it from a kind of post-mining perspective as well, so that they can be really useful tools. And again, that's another area where we think there's huge potential for kind of more creative approaches. Commercial post-mining joint ventures, some of these go under the ground, actually, sort of, or under the radar, because they're sort of a company will take on sort of former mining land and regenerate it into a, sometimes an industrial area. Pretty unexciting, but actually really important way to do it. And often sort of behind the scenes, kind of many different parties involved in that in different shapes and forms. So we'll talk about the Sunmine Canada example in Canada. But also some really sort of interesting, unusual combinations as well. So not always just sort of light industrial areas that the mine land has been redeveloped into. Some really interesting ones around kind of bioeconomy campus in Ireland, the Emma water plant, so kind of processing mine water, but providing that to clean drinking water to communities. Daybreak, new housing estate on mine land. The Stall Underground Physics Lab in Australia, and also actually there's quite a few underground physics labs in mines around the world, and they're all really interesting and actually very different models to sort of how that's being developed. And then Regeneration Enterprises, which is sort of rehabilitating mine land as well, sort of an NGO led by the NGO Resolve. Really interesting example there as well. So maybe looking at the Sun Mine in Canada, the Sullivan Mine, operated for many decades, really important part. Collaborative planning processes started way kind of actually decades before closure as well, with lots of meetings around that. And actually different approaches to sort of regenerating that land. So happened to be in a place that was very conducive to developing ski resorts and golf resorts as well, residential housing. One of the interesting ones was this solar panel plant that was built on former tailings deposits, rehabilitated land, but developed a collaboration between a non-profit solar developer, the local government, and the company all coming together to develop a solar plant as well, and run as a commercial operation, and then actually sort of sold back to the company to reduce the risk for the municipality as well. But that also allowed further expansion as well. So something that wouldn't have happened at all unless those three parties came together kind of quite creatively to work that out. Some of the last ones, economic development, investment vehicles. So some really good examples of government-led and funded investment in former coal mining areas, often at a regional level, and sort of really recognizing that role of very significant government financing in redeveloping areas as well, both physical rehabilitation, but also sort of pushing into sort of economic regional development opportunities as well. And finally, monitoring committees. So the sort of important role, often they may evolve from those original closure planning committees, but the role that communities can play in basically seeing, is this going the way that we need it to, and sort of giving communities a voice in saying what is successful, and is this working as well. So again, another really kind of interesting and actually kind of quite different approach to how different stakeholders get together. Just to flag to some of the tools, as I said, we've sort of signposted some of the many different really good tools and approaches that are out there already, that can be drawn into in different ways in these spaces and in sort of different combinations for those multi-stakeholder approaches. So really just to sort of point you towards those as well. And as I said, this was a real multi-stakeholder effort, and just really appreciate sort of all of the different kind of points of view and expertise that has come into to build all of this. So we've got a few minutes left, I think, maybe for some questions and comments. Guy, I'll maybe kind of hand back to you to sort of guide us through.
Amazing. Thank you, Ed and Liz, for that thorough presentation on the handbook. I think we can all see the richness that is in this, and I'll go back to Amber's original opening comments around the complexity of this, and I just think this handbook is so powerful in unpacking some of that complexity and providing some really critical guidance that we can use. There's a couple of questions that have come through. Please keep them coming through. The first one is around government appetite. So again, in those opening comments, there was sort of this recognition that the regulatory environment can tend to push things towards rehabilitation and return to prior state as the preferred outcome. And there's a question around appetite of governments to support these novel and alternative economic transitions or types of transitions. Does anyone want to comment on that and what you see movements in governments? Yeah, Amber?
Yeah, just to say, I think it varies so much, you know. I think it's so dependent on that jurisdiction's kind of legal framework and how progressive their approach or strategy is, and, you know, whether they've been burnt before in some kind of similar previous agreement. But can certainly sympathise with your situation. Some areas are incredibly I guess, wary and careful of the implications and the possible liabilities associated with the post-mining land uses. But again, I think it's kind of through, you know, building the relationship and building their understanding is really the way that you can make progress. Liz or Ed, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. I think in many of the cases that we saw, government was a really important player. But also in very different shapes and forms. Sometimes it's a national government, sometimes it's the obvious ones who are kind of, you know, permitting, but actually many of the really interesting ones was where there was kind of local government driven as well. So yeah, definitely I think it's sort of and recognizing the importance and the role, and often the massive funding that goes behind it from a government point of view as well, that kind of in a way can sometimes completely dwarf any mining company funded closure planning funding as well. The amount that goes into some of these initiatives can be huge as well. So yeah, really recognizing them as a success factor for sure.
Really interesting, and I might throw to the question come up on the local government. But the other piece I found interesting in that multi-stakeholder conversation is when we were starting the CRC, we would often be pointed towards the regulatory parts of government. And what I've noticed, and it aligns really well with this multi-stakeholder, is these are often whole of government or central government sorts of initiatives that start to drive a transition-based conceptualisation, not necessarily the regulatory parts of the parts of government. Your regulatory parts are really critical to that conversation, but that's what we're seeing in some parts of states and territories around Australia, a bit more of either Treasury or Chief Minister's Office or central bodies of government starting to look at the transition and how they work with regulators. So even within government, recognising the multiple stakeholders that exist, I think is a great segue. But this comment then going back to the local government, so Ed, you've noted there, and this idea that local governments are actually often now looking in land planning schemes and looking at benefit sharing arrangements, particularly with that intersection between renewable energy and post-mining land and the transition that the renewable energy is driving so quickly. Any comments both on benefit sharing and sort of that interaction with, particularly with the energy transition?
I think, yes, definitely we're seeing that, and that almost seems to be not quite a default option, but a very common suggestion of like, can we put, you know, wind or solar on kind of former mined land? But actually the sort of number of cases that we see that actually work are kind of relatively rare, kind of once you work through that process of kind of what's the best use for that. But yeah, definitely an option. I think maybe what we see is where it's done in a way that helps enable and create space for creativity, for those entrepreneurs to come in, for those different ideas to come in as well. You know, we just really see that all of this is so context specific as well, and not just because of the geography and the landscape, but also the people and the organizations involved. So something which doesn't say this has to be turned into kind of, you know, and be used for renewable energy, but something that says, you know, who wants to come to the table with an idea and run with something. Those tend to be the more successful things. I think part of the challenge that we had was almost trying to see any sort of shape or structure or pattern or commonality between all of these different shapes and forms. So you can see all these sort of lovely boxes and diagrams that we've come up, but it's actually been a real challenge to sort of put any shape or form in it, because all these examples are so diverse, and so anything that allows and embraces that diversity and encourages it is really important. So the local government support for that can be really important, and often it's around having that common community vision, people coming together and saying, here's the future that we would like, and that sort of opens it up for everyone to, you know, or a diverse set of voices to come in and be involved in that what does the future look like discussion and implementation. Liz, you've probably got some thoughts as well.
Just an example of it is rolling around my head, which was a conversation from a few years ago of a community who were, I guess, near a closed mine. A mine had been closed for quite a few years, and there was a conversation about whether or not solar panels could maybe be put on the tailing site, etc., etc. A fairly normal conversation. And in speaking with the community, the understanding was that during the time since the mine had closed, a maximum security prison had been put in place in a nearby community. And the single most important thing in this community, as articulated then, was more accommodation, because there needed to be accommodation for people who wanted to move close to family members who were serving time. And that wasn't something that was going to come out of an entrepreneurial conversation around such and such. That required sitting down and actually getting to know that community a bit better. And I mean, it hasn't yet happened, but it's being open to the possibility that it might look quite different from what it has happened somewhere else. But if it's going to survive in that community, it needs to be something that the community can get behind. So yeah, just maybe as a final thought.
We are on time, but I'm going to be sneaking just put that one question in on the planning process, in particular to the mine element blocks and flexibility and how you leave some openness, I think, in the planning and community prioritised process. Any quick remarks on those ones before we wrap up?
I think this, I haven't been following the chat too closely, but I think seeing a few comments around how do you let go of control, I think that's a fabulous question. And that comes into everything, sort of, when do you start talking about these things? What is really in play? Kind of, are you actually going to start these conversations at a time where you're prepared to consider a whole range of assets, or are you really going to do your feasibility study for closure, and only once you've got the perfect solution do you go and start talking about it? So there is a willingness that companies need to have to forego a little bit of control. And that might mean that there's costs that are harder to predict. That might mean that there's timelines that are harder to schedule. It could mean a lot of things. But if the counter argument, and it sort of comes back a little bit to the same conversation around regulators, we always need to understand the counter argument. Yes, there might be some cost and schedule uncertainty, but was there really cost and schedule certainty under the other option, the totally planned version that may not have worked? Similarly with regulators, kind of, yes, we might be nervous about a new form of land use, but was a regulator really going to be comfortable re-accepting a facility in the first place at a 23-degree slope or whatever it is? So I do think that sometimes being able to put multiple things on the table changes that dynamic, rather than it being a conversation that's focused on a singular option and whether or not that singular option does or doesn't suit everybody. I don't know, Ed, did you want to add?
I think I got distracted by there's some really good questions coming in as well. But one is, how hard is it for mining companies to let go? I think actually many of the really good examples of transition that we draw on is where companies haven't been part of the picture at all. So we sort of they've closed, they've gone bankrupt or whatever, and actually then it's only then that local communities, local governments step in and say, what are we going to do about it? So that's given us the examples to say we know what can work, and it doesn't always need mining companies kind of to lead and plan the process. So we know that if companies do let go, then others can step in really successfully. Actually, going back to the very beginning, the Eden project is a case in point. Didn't involve the mining company at all. The mining company sold that asset to the Eden project to develop, and didn't have anything subsequently to do with it at all. So I think that's a really important thing to consider. But what can a mining company do to help enable, push it along, kind of create those places is a really important question. And I think we are seeing companies recognizing that as well, for sure.
Look, such a rich conversation, and one of the conversations I've been following at the same time, very recent, the bank and industry, the pension funds, is looking at BNP Paribas has just recently hosted an asset management as part of the Global Decommissioning Summit. And just one of the emerging themes this week has just come out in reframing the spend that companies make on closure into these value optimization types approaches. And this is a sort of a theme that I've seen, and it's picked up in a couple of the comments throughout the handbook. No matter who the stakeholders are involved, it's moving and shifting it from a risk mitigation story to a value optimization story to get the most appropriate fit for purpose transition that is realistic for a region as well. And I'll throw back again to Amber's comments. And another line, communities need certainty, as much certainty as possible. And so the other side of these things is participating in planning processes, being involved in them, can manage expectations and be clear on what's actually achievable and realistic with the types of stakeholders around the table. So look, a huge thank you and acknowledgement to the outstanding panel and presenters we've had today. I can't obviously overstate how important I think this handbook is in the current landscape, and how useful. And this is the other thing to all three of you guys, that the notes in the chat, lots of comments about the deep, the use of the tools, the case studies that are all captured in this, incredibly valuable for those of us all in the trenches working to do these things better. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for participating today.